welcome to Farm Year Daily, a Field Forward podcast. I'm your host, David Geiger. Today on Farm Year Daily, an early look at some yields in central Iowa. We hear from Iowa agronomist Meaghan Anderson about the crops she's looking at. Please be sure to like and follow the podcast as well as our social media at Field Forward Pod. We would love to have you join our community, keeping folks informed about what is affecting our farmers. This is Farm Year Daily. And joining me on Farm Year Daily, we're going to take a look at the crop fields in central Iowa. With me is Meaghan Anderson, ISU Extension agronomist for central Iowa. Meaghan, joining me from a cornfield. It looks like it's pretty mature as well. How you doing, Meaghan? And where are you at?
I'm doing fine, thanks. I am standing in a cornfield in Dallas County. It's a field that I've checked on, once a month this whole summer. So this is my last field check. So luckily I'm out here by now because it looks like it's about ready to be harvested by the looks of the plants anyway.
That's what I was thinking. The last crop progress report we had, that's kind of in the minority of fields at the moment.
Yeah, I did my yield tour that I do in Polk County every year, and I was kind of surprised that not quite half of them were at physiological maturity. I thought it'd be further than that, or there'd be more of them at physiological maturity just based on how quickly it seems like the season has kind of ended. But everything was really within, a couple weeks of being at the end of the season. So we're probably not too far off of normal, but maybe a little bit ahead just based on the look of everything on the landscape and how many combines seem to be rolling right now.
I'd, of course, like to talk about some of the general trends we're seeing across the central part of Iowa, but you mentioned that that yield tour you were doing there. Tell me about that. I was interested in learning more about the kind of yields you were seeing.
Yeah, I do this every year at least. So this will be my, fifth year, I think, doing this. That I try to get to 12 to 14 fields in Polk County. Usually do it at the end of August, but this year it got pushed into September due to my schedule. And we go in and take a single yield estimate in each field. And so this year we did 16 fields. So we have 16 yield estimates, and then we go through some calculations on those to come up with an average Polk County yield. And so I always caution people against extrapolating that too much to represent any more of Iowa. But it gives me a really good opportunity to look at how does this crop compare to what we have seen in past years, and where have things shifted, right? What are the stand counts in comparison to the prior several years? How many kernels long, how many kernels around, those kinds of things, and where are our yield components changing to come up with the yields that we get anyway.
I think Polk County might be a good representation this year because it was kind of in the middle of not being quite as wet as the north and not being quite as dry this last month as the south. So where did it stand then? What kind of are some of the results this year?
Yeah, so the range was 174 to 254, 255 bushels per acre, which is not all that unusual to get a pretty substantial range when you're taking a single stand count and yield estimate per field. But the average came out to be 202 and a half. And so, it's just that. It's just an estimate. We'll see kind of how things shape up as harvest continues along. But right now, it seems like it's a lot more in line with what we saw in 2023 from our final crop yields than it is from 2024, which I think virtually anybody I would talk to would probably agree with that, right? Last year was really high crop yields. And it looks like about this year, we're something like 10% off of last year based on that yield estimate. And then I'm hearing from other farmers in other counties and hearing kind of a lot of the same, right? So some people are pretty disappointed in their yields so far, and others are pleasantly surprised. And it's all kind of evening out to be right above 200 or so probably so far.
What were you expecting when you first walked into the fields?
Well, that's a good question. I don't really know what I was expecting. I think I expected to see a lot more southern rust clearly apparent. I thought maybe I'd end up orange like I did earlier this summer when I went out.
I don't see any orange right now.
I was not orange. This is that field. I'm actually in the same field that was full of southern rust. And so if you look at it now, I don't know if you can see here.
Oh yeah, I can see
it. We are crispy brown dead. And these will turn black here eventually and start releasing spores. And so it is probably going to be a pretty dusty harvest in this field.
Right.
there was a ton of variability in the Polk County fields. And I don't know if my memory is just getting shorter, but it feels like it was more than I've seen the past several years, which makes sense because we got rain and, we've got some prairie pothole areas and things like that. Our stand counts were fairly similar to last year. I think we had longer ears and just a little bit thinner around, fewer kernels around on average. And just that little bit of change in stand count and a little bit of reduction in the number of kernels that we were getting led me to come up with a lower yield estimate. More similar to 2023, but we actually had bigger ears this year, but we had way higher stand counts in 23 in Polk County. So I had
wow,
it was just about 2,000 plants per acre higher was my average stand count in 23 compared with this year. And so it's fun for me to be able to look at these different yield components and say, look, like these plants were super optimistic, right? We had good kernels around, right? Just slightly lower than last year. We had really long ears, which I think is reflective of the conditions that we had, in late June and ahead of pollination. And then during pollination, we had pretty good weather as well. And so the big question mark in my mind, and I think in everybody else's mind, is what is this going to look like at the end? How filled out are these kernels going to be? How big are they going to be? And, how much kind of density are we going to get at the end of the season compared with some of these prior years? Because we know that at least in some fields like this one, that southern rust really whipped through it and took a lot of that yield potential out, I think.
There were some early crop estimates being done at the beginning of August and then again in the middle of August, and some were higher and then some were lower for the state of Iowa specifically. Was there a change in the last 3 weeks that may have seen the crops be helped out a bit?
I mean, certainly the cooler conditions that we had late last week and kind of through the weekend into early this week, I think is helpful for anything that wasn't finished yet. I think the challenge is that balance of how much benefit can that provide us if this crop is really close to maturity, right? We know if we're past R5.5, that half milk line, there's a pretty small percentage of yield left to be gained at that point, or left to be accumulated at that point, I guess. And we know that southern rust had already gone through a lot of these canopies, and a number of fields were probably already at physiological maturity well before this last weekend, maybe close to 40 or so percent here in central Iowa. And so I don't know how much help we're going to have gotten from that little bit of cool condition, but we certainly, we at least slowed down the southern rust for anything that's still working on maturing.
This is Farm Your Daily. We will continue the conversation in just a moment, but first, let's take a look at the marketplace. And after the WASDE report for the close on Friday, there was green across the board in grains. December corn, 10 1/4 cents higher, $4.30. March rising a dime at $4.47 1/4. Soybeans in November, 12 3/4 cents more, $10.46 1/4, with January an increase of 12 3/4 at $10.65 1/4. Soybean meal in October, $1.50 a ton in the green, $287.60. Soybean oil in October, half a penny higher, $51.67 a pound. December wheat, 2 cents up, $5.23 1/2, with March rising 2 3/4 at $5.41. And hard red winter wheat in December, 4 3/4 cents more, $5.14 3/4, with March an increase of 4 3/4 at $5.35. Looking at the livestock market close for Friday, October live cattle, $2.30 a hundredweight in the red at $229.97. December falling $2.20 at $231.92. Feeder cattle in September, $4.82 a hundredweight weaker, $350.40. October falling $6.55 at $345.80. Lean hogs in October, $1.05 a hundredweight lower at $97.12, with December a decrease of 62 cents at $88.62 a hundredweight. That is the Friday market close. This is Farm Your Daily. All right, Meaghan, you're out in some fields today taking measurements of the corn crop. Let's talk more broadly about central Iowa, your area. Any other notes farmers are making about corn? And then what about soybeans? What are you seeing in terms of what we need to finish up the soybean crop and what you're seeing?
So as far as the corn crop goes, I think I've seen enough of the corn stand, and I'm hearing enough from people to hear that things are pretty concerning as far as the standability of the crop. It is quite dry out there for especially any of this really early stuff that's maybe 105-day or less, maybe even a little bit higher than that. We're seeing numbers in the teens already for moistures. And so if you had an early planted, short RM, maybe go take a look at it, right? Make sure it's still standing okay. Make sure there's a stock route that's going to take it out. And then make sure that it's not already mature and needing to get out of the field, I guess. As far as soybeans go, they really seem like they hung on green for a long time. They looked a lot better overall, I thought, than the corn did, aside from the fact that we definitely had patches that were sort of disappearing due to the SDS, a little bit of disease pressure that was out in the canopy. But they really seem to have taken a turn here with I don't know if it was the cooler weather this last weekend or they just kind of finally gave up because, it's time for them to start maturing. But we're really starting to see a lot more evening yellowing and some maturity out of these beans. And so I do think we'll take a bit of the corn crop out before we get to them, but it'll be interesting to see how well those beans took advantage of all that moisture that we had. We know they don't like wet feet, but we do know that they need moisture during the kind of latter part of July and during August to make nice plump soybeans. So we'll see kind of how much that bean size has been affected by the rainfall that we did get and how it turns out at the end of the season. I'm always hesitant to talk about bean yields because it always seems like, we'd have the prettiest, tallest, nicest looking soybean crop that doesn't yield worth a darn. So I'll withhold judgment on the beans here until I hear some more from farmers.
Absolutely. As the follow-up to that, though, when you're dealing with kind of later green beans and you're also dealing with pretty strong growth, there's going to be some chewing issues going as farmers are rolling through the fields. Are you seeing particularly thick stems for them?
I don't know that the stems themselves are particularly thick, but certainly those beans that, they're planted late, they're super healthy, especially if they got dry and they kind of get resurrected by a late rain. We always end up with some of those green, chewy stems. If they've had a fungicide on them, that can make it worse. All kinds of things. There's a whole host of issues that can cause that green stem problem in beans. And I know it's super frustrating for farmers when they're dealing with really, really dry beans and really chewy stems that are tough to get through and they're having to wait till the afternoons to get out there and start cutting them. I don't know how big of an issue it'll be this year. We'll see. They're pretty green late, so it certainly could be a problem out on the landscape. But I think everybody's pretty focused on either holding out a little bit longer for harvest or getting started on corn right now. I haven't seen any beans taken out yet.
Absolutely. Then as we do approach that harvest, any notes you like to make as a reminder for folks as they're rolling out, safety or otherwise, as they get ready this year?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the safety expert, but I am a farmer's daughter, and my brother's farming just a few miles down the road from me right now. And so safety, I think, is always super important. We're expected to be warmer than average, likely to have spells between rainfalls this fall. Hopefully we're not quite as dry as we were last fall, but things are likely to be dusty. They're likely to be pretty dry. We may get some residue hung up in headers and things that we need to be pulling out. So just making sure we're being as safe as possible when we're handling this crop for, our physical health dealing with equipment, but also our health managing with all the dust. And so just trying to reduce your exposure, I think, is really important to that as well.
Absolutely. So the final points to take away is make sure you're scouting for that standability in corn and watching out for some of the green beans that are out there.
Absolutely.
Meaghan Anderson is the Central Iowa Agronomist for ISU Extension. Thank you so much, Meaghan, for joining us on Farm Your Daily, and have a good rest of scouting opportunity. We appreciate those numbers of you scouting those fields for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, David.
This is Farm Your Daily, a Field Forward podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Again, in order to continue to produce this type of local content, we would love to have you join our community. So please follow the podcast as well as our social media channels at Field Forward Pod. You can also find me on social media at Geiger Reports. Again, I am your host, David Geiger, and I'll see you again on Monday. Have a good weekend, everybody.